Good afternoon. This weekend, we are observing the second week of what we call creation season, when we reflect on our role in the environment, both in terms of nurturing it and damaging it and appreciating it and remembering that the depth of our identity is in the web of relationships with all creation. This weekend is remarkable. We have the anniversary of 9/11. We have the wildfires in California and the western states, in addition to a fire in a refugee center in Lesbos. We're honoring the choir at our church, and we are surrounded, and then with the latest news on the coronavirus and the latest political news, we find ourselves surrounded by awareness and images of the damage that we do, of what is broken in our relationships. And Sunday's gospel and our reflection this week needs to be about the ways in which those relationships are not broken. The gospel for Sunday is the gospel in which Jesus teaches us about the birds of the air and the lilies of the field. Let me remind you of this. Look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. Yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not clothed like one of these. What I'd like us to remember, what Jesus is teaching here today, is not to diminish the burdens that we carry, not to diminish our responsibilities, but to remind ourselves that in the big picture, we worship a life-giving God who will always provide what is needed. I was realizing today that even in our study of evolution, we talk about the survival of the fittest and how species die out. But it occurred to me that in our understanding of the planet, of the cosmos, of human history, of the physical environment, of the animal kingdom, of all species, the record that we have, cosmological, planetary, physical, is a sequence of emerging openings where new species will emerge, or where an existing species can continue to live. An opening will pop up, however we describe that as scientists or storytellers. So what we are called to do today and encouraged to do this weekend is to look for the openings that occur in the midst of very crowded and chaotic lives. I want to share with you a story that was told by the Jesuit storyteller Anthony de Mello. At one time, there was a monastery that was famous throughout the world. Many young men went there aspiring to become monks. The music filled the chapel and the countryside. People came for healing, for prayer, for a sense of new life. And then it came upon hard times and people stopped coming. Young men stopped aspiring to become monks. Their music gradually died down. And so the abbot sought advice from a guru that he knew. And he went to the guru, meditating in his cave, and he said, "Is it because of some sin of ours that our monastery has been reduced the way it is?" And the guru said, "Yes, it is a sin. It's the sin of ignorance." And the abbot said, "Well, how can that be?" And the guru said, "One of your number is the Messiah in disguise, and you are ignorant of this." So throughout his journey back to the monastery, the abbot's heart beat, and he thought and thought and thought that if the Messiah himself had returned to earth and was right there in the monastery, well, how could he have not recognized him? How could it be? He kind of went down the list of monks, and every time he thought of a monk, he thought of that monk's failures, that monk's flaws, that monk's defects. And then he thought, well, I wonder if those defects are a disguise. of the Messiah. So he got back to the monastery and he called the monks together and he told them what he had been told. And they looked at each other in disbelief. The Messiah here? But he was in disguise. So maybe if we pay attention, we will learn to recognize him. Is it this person? Is it that person? But if the Messiah was there in disguise, it was not likely that they would recognize him. So they took to treating everyone with respect and consideration. They started laughing off and laughing away the irritations and the defects that had caused division prior to that. You never know. Whenever they had a conversation with each other in their own heads, they said, you never know, maybe this person is the Messiah in disguise. And as a result of that, the monastery began to grow again, and it became vibrant with joy, and people again came from all the corners of the world in order to experience this glow of love. And so what this story describes is what creation season is about and what Jesus teaches in his teaching about the birds of the air and the lilies of the field. During creation season, our readings and prayers call attention to the ways in which our deepest identity is grounded in our relationships with all that is living. This week, even when we see all the destructive effects of our planet getting warmer, we remember that we are bound together in a life that cannot be quenched, and that our job as faithful people is to look for the openings that God has inserted into our lives. Yes, we must be mindful of the irreversible damage caused by human carelessness, and we must act out of fear, not out of fear, but out of hope. Seeing the beauty of the earth does not mean that we do not recognize its dangers. Wonder at the resilience of natural life does not mean that we ignore our own role in sustaining that life. And this is what Jesus is teaching his disciples. He's teaching them to look at the world as a web of relationships that both free and bind us. They're used to looking at the world in terms of predators and victims. He's speaking to people who eke out their existence in an arid land, where the fruitful land is owned by unjust landowners. And people they probably saw birds either as a source of food or as predators who threatened their own plantings. And Jesus calls them and calls us to pay attention to the beauty and diversity of the world, to our relationship to the birds that are flying and to the flowers that are growing. A beauty and diversity that we cannot see if our head is always bent to the ground, bowed down by burdens and by worry about putting one foot in front of the other. Jesus calls our attention to the peace and freedom we could experience if we used our instincts to find the spiritual food and water and shelter that we need, and if we trusted our intuitive sense on how to share these resources with other people. If we paid attention to abundance rather than scarcity, to gifts freely given to us more often than to our need. If we could act out of trust rather than of need or fear. If we could keep in mind that Christ is among us, disguised. If we could keep our antennae open to and alert to the openings that are being created before our very eyes that may not look like openings. They may look like chasms. They may look like walls. But if it is in the natural order of things, which in our tradition we proclaim to be a divine order of things, right? In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word is God. If the natural cycle of life is the continual and repeated emergence of openings for new life and for the blossoming of ongoing life, then our job is to be mindful of the possibilities that are opening before us that we may not have known about. Remember that Jesus is also teaching, part of the reason he talks about the birds and the lilies of the field is to make a distinction between worshiping the nature gods, which all the cultures around the Jews did, and worshiping the one God who cared for the diversity of natural life, for all the birds and all the flowers and all the land. He's reminding them that they have a monotheistic tradition that has been validated by their own experience. But it's easy to forget because they're so busy trying to eke out a living on hard land and minimal resources. He teaches them that being mindful of a beauty and abundance is itself an act of faith and is itself a prayer, a primer on how to live without fear, even if there might be much to be afraid of. He teaches them an alternative to feeling burdened by the physical hardship of their lives. He's not advocating complacency. He's not pretending that we all live in a paradise or that our burdens are not real. He's not telling us to get over it and to stop singing a pity song. What he's saying is that the burdens that weigh on us are simply one part of our lives. They are not our whole lives. The longing and the worry that we feel is only one option among the many things that we can feel. He's asking us to make space for an opening that God will eventually create in our lives because that is the way of life. He's asking us to make space for something new in our lives, not to ignore our burdens and responsibilities, but to recognize that they are not our complete identity or our complete life. While they will always be with us, we are growing into a future where they will not dominate. Deepak Chopra has said, distance yourself from past expectations, and in that way, something unexpected can emerge. In this period when we're continually reinventing ourselves every week and every month, we are challenged in this time of pandemic to put aside our past expectations, not to keep grasping for life as we think we knew it, but to be open, to put those aside, to trust what we've learned, to trust in the stability of our faith, of our capacity to survive. And if we can do that, that we will be open to possibilities we haven't yet imagined. Hope is not the complacency of a comfortable and self-indulgent people. Trusting in God does not mean that we sit around and wait for God to come up and clean up our messes. It means facing the damage that we have done, whether it's in relationships, whether it's in the world, to recognize our own complicity in the overwhelming damage that is being done, particularly with the fires now, with the melting of the snowcap, with all the environmental instability that we must face. We have had a role of that. We need to make ourselves accountable for that. But that is not all of who we are. Just because we say Christ is among us in disguise does not mean that any one of us is God who has the license to play God. It means that we worship a God who will always surprise us in a life-giving way, in a way that we would not be able to surprise ourselves. This weekend also, we're honoring the music ministry at Trinity. And many of us miss the music of worship because it is in music that we also express the invisible relationships with all creation and with the cosmos. So I want to end by reading the words of a hymn by Thomas Toger. called Learn from All the Songs of the Earth. That we never sing alone, that our music has its birth in what wind and wave intone, that before God spoke a word, God first blew upon the sea, and the breath of music stirred everything that came to be. The creation God conceives brims with melody and breath, from the wind among the leaves to the thunderstorm's retreat, from the whispering of snow to the waterfall that sings. Psalms and anthems rise and flow from the plainest simple things. And the songs we long to hear in the creature's chirps and cries, from the notes that signal fear to the hymns that fill the skies, become us to join Earth's choir with our own distinctive parts that God's melodies inspire in the spirit fills our hearts. When we harmonize with Earth and its elemental song, we recall who gave us birth and to whom we all belong. We more deeply understand what the living Christ displays. We are fashioned by God's hand for a life that sings God's praise. Amen.